Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to speak. Well, we looked at the title of the conference as New Challenges for Development Cooperation, and our presentation particularly relates to a challenge that the dominant way of thinking about developing countries is now outdated, and we need something a bit more sophisticated in terms of not only in terms of overseas development assistance, but perhaps in the way Europe and aid agencies support development cooperation with developing countries. So, the presentation is largely three substantive sections in between the introduction and the conclusion, and you can kind of see who's going to be talking for each part. Sergio will talk a bit about classifying countries, then we'll talk about how we developed the multidimensional taxonomy of developing countries, and then we'll talk about the outcome and a discussion of some of the implications. So first of all, I mean, I've worked on a set of papers since... so are you doing that one? Yeah. So we got the computer that's not connected to the... Hence, what we're doing. A set of papers since mid-late 2010 on the changing pattern of global poverty. The basic idea is very simplistic, that global poverty has shifted from being an issue related to low-income countries, countries under $1,000 per capita, to one where three-quarters of the world's extreme poor, that's those under $1.25, or those who are multidimensional poor, the same is true of various health and nutrition indicators, live in middle-income countries. So there's about 1 billion extreme poor people in middle-income countries. So this was perhaps surprising, because you would expect the world's extreme poor to be in the low-income countries. What actually happened underlying that is again, relatively simple. A group of countries, 5 very populous countries, got richer in average income terms. In fact, a lot of developing countries are getting significantly better off in average income terms. But 30 in particular passed the threshold that the World Bank uses, and many aid agencies make some use of, albeit in different ways, to gain middle-income status. And 5 populous countries, 5 countries that are home to 2/3 of the world's poor, shifted from low income to middle income. Those are the pinkies, which is Pakistan, India, Nigeria, China, and Indonesia. So that's the underlying story. The first question you could ask is so what? You know, what difference does this make? I mean, first of all, the dominant analytical categories are very widely used, not only by the World Bank, who has quite a complex set of additional lines, but also by different aid agencies, multilateral and bilateral, in various ways and under various formulas, sometimes with other indicators added. At a minimum, it's considered middle income status is a reason to discontinue overseas development assistance. And obviously there's been a lot of debate around EC ending of ODA to a number of middle-income countries. And there's also been a kind of crazy debate in the UK about India, and a very sort of emotional debate about whether the UK should give aid to India. Actually, in the end, India made it clear that it didn't need the aid, so that was fairly straightforward. There are 2 views that are not necessarily incompatible. The first is that the analytical categories that we use for developing countries, or the dominant analytical categories, are moribund, which means dead or dying. So either these categories are dead or dying, or severe poverty, or extreme poverty, is in the process of nationalizing. Now, what I mean by poverty nationalizing is that for many countries, ending poverty, extreme poverty, may be around 1% of GDP. So by nationalizing poverty, I mean it potentially is achievable with the resources that many countries have, Of course, there's question marks about administration, state capability, about politics, about who decides who spends what money and where. But I think there's interesting questions arising if a number of countries theoretically have the finances to end extreme poverty. Typically in middle-income countries, the poverty rate at $2 is about 40%. Okay, in some countries it's higher, some countries lower, but there's still a significant amount of poverty. So we're going to, in this particular presentation, we explore view A. Elsewhere I've explored view B. I mean, my own personal opinion is that both views actually have some validity in future. Okay. So in this paper, we review the meaning of development in light of this. Of course, there's a long history of challenging income per capita as the dominant way of thinking about development and dominant indicator, going back to at least Dudley Sears's work in the late 1960s, if not before. And what we do is we look at the debate about the meaning of development and use that to generate a taxonomy of countries that demonstrates three things, we think. First is that income per capita, although this has been said many times before, overall is quite a weak proxy for multidimensional development. It's quite possible to have rising average income, or even average income at around $10, $15 a day in PPP, and yet predominantly an agricultural economy or labour force in agriculture. We also find that development is actually, it appears in the data, non-linear. By that we mean, if you look across the various dimensions of development, they don't all get better together and in a sort of easy, straight, linear relationship. And indeed, when you come to look at global poverty, it's not a question of low-income countries, which are LIC, and middle-income countries, which are MIC. It's 5 different types of developing country, which we outline, that suggest a much more complicated global distribution.
Thank you, Andy. So let me first start saying thank you to our Czech colleagues for organizing this very pleasant meeting in such a beautiful city, and also for giving us the opportunity to present here the main results of our current research project. As you can hear, I will speak in perfect Spanglish, but very imperfect English. So the good thing for you is that you will hear a variety of English dialects, the French English, Spanglish, and British English, which is becoming less common. So let's now deal with the main question of this research. Why classify countries? Well, as we will try to show you, the development taxonomies are not an easy task. Actually, they are pretty complex work. Whoops. So, thank you. So the things are getting more complex as developing countries become more heterogeneous over time, and also developing taxonomies are difficult because we are seeking to classify moving objects in the sense that countries are constantly evolving in terms of social, political, or economical variables. So it's not easy at all to classify countries, even less in a statical way. So given such the difficulties, the million-dollar question is, why are country classifications required at all? Well, we have found a number of reasons, and we divided them into blocks. The first group are analytical reasons. Classifications, if you think of it, are very common in different scientific disciplines. In development studies, we use classifications to help us understand the most significant inter-country differences. That is to say, we try to find similarities across countries and also differences across countries. Also, taxonomies, development taxonomies, or international classifications, simplifies a complex and a very diverse developing world into relatively homogeneous groups of countries. On the other hand, there are a number of operational reasons to do these classifications. For multilateral and bilateral aid agencies, classifications are very useful because they help them to allocate resources, to design differentiated public policies towards different countries, and also to set aid targets, like the 0.7 aid target to developing countries or the 0.2% aid target to least developing countries. So classifications are useful in this sense. What we all know is that the dominant classification is the World Bank Income Classification, which has been published since 1978, and it gives us 3 groups of developing countries, from low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and upper middle-income countries. And this classification is used by both multilateral and bilateral aid agencies to to manage aid policies. To begin with, because eligible countries for aid recipients must be low or middle-income countries. That means that they have to have an income below the $2,500 a year. So, given the limitation of the World Bank Income Classification, our main research question is it possible to do any better, given this arbitrary nature of the income classification? And that's the reason why we build this multidimensional taxonomy of developing countries.
Okay. So first we start off in the paper. So the paper is available as a working paper on the Institute of Development Studies, where I was based up to 6 months ago. And the paper is also, there's a later version of the paper actually with a journal. So first of all, when we talk in the paper about different frames on development, we talk about the last 30, 40, 50 years and discuss the kind of evolution of thinking about development. In the first instance, around the sort of 60s in particular, 1950s, there was a sense of development as structural development. By that, I mean the transformation of a rural agricultural economy to a modern industrial economy, particularly associated, again, with Dudley Sears' seminal work in the 60s and early 70s, but many others. I mean, Prebisch, Myrdal, and others. But then in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, we have this evolution into human development, obviously associated with Amartya Sen, about capabilities, functionings beyond income per capita, the real kind of critique of income per capita, and going beyond that, and particularly the Human Development Report of UNDP and the Human Development Indices. Then evolving after that, we have a lot of debate, particularly since the late 1990s, around governance and democratic participation, defined in many different ways. But with a course around a set of issues around human rights, corruption, rule of law, but also around democracy defined as well in various ways, not only by participation in elections. And then, of course, increasingly over the last 20 years, there's been questions about environmental sustainability, now looking in particular at climate change, but also other aspects of the environment. We could have also added into this some of the debates over the last 10 years around stability, fragility, fragile states or state capabilities. For the moment, we found the data sets too problematic, and we think some of those issues are actually included under governance. We could have also gone into the debate over the last 5 years of development around subjective well-being and people's reported satisfaction with progress in their country, particularly using the World Values Survey. Again, we had some question marks about the data, so we didn't go ahead and include that. And it's also, these are relatively new areas that are evolving over the last 10 years, and so we stayed with the frames that we felt were particularly stable and well developed. So we took the indicators that we thought would proxy some of those, and they're listed here under structural change, human development, good governance, democratic participation, and environmental sustainability. The structural change ones relate to the structure of the economy, of course, human development to poverty, inequality, nutrition, but also to income per capita, which is part of the Human Development Index, and governance to the two widely used data sets on governance indicators. Oh, there you are, sorry. Okay, and I'll hand back to Sergio.
Can you take the this and I take it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's
Nice division of labor.
It's quite difficult because you have to deal with the computer and at the same time the other computer, so it can be a bit messy. So let me explain you in a nutshell what's the methodology that we have used to build this development taxonomy. Well, we have used what is called a hierarchical cluster analysis, which help us to build a taxonomy of developing countries with heterogeneous levels of development into 5 different groups of developing countries. And the classification has to meet 4 important conditions. Each country must belong to one and only one group. All countries must be classified. Countries of the same group are supposed to be alike, that is to say similar. And fourthly, countries of different groups must be noticeably dissimilar. The advantage of this procedure is that it helps us to identify what is called the association structure. That is to say, the main similarities among countries within the same cluster and the main dissimilarities or differences across different clusters. This is just a summary of the procedure. We run a hierarchical cluster analysis, the work method, using a square Euclidean distance and standardizing the variables. Our sample includes 101 developing countries out of 139 low and middle income countries, and this means almost 73% of developing countries and around 90%, 95% of developing countries' population. Well, firstly, we try to find out which are the most influential variables in our classification. The good news is that we are using 11 variables, and all those variables were statistically significant in the analysis, but there were 3 very influential ones. The most influential one is poverty, followed by productivity and quality of democracy. And the 3 variables with the weakest power for discriminating between groups are external finance, inequality, and primary exports. Well, let us show you the main results. What we found is 5 different groups of developing countries instead of those 3 income groups that the World Bank uses. And this classification differs notably from the World Bank classification. In fact, there is less than 50% of coincidence between both classifications. Well, let me show you the main characteristics of each of these 5 clusters. The cluster 1 are countries with high poverty rates and largely traditional economies in the Dudley-Sear sense. This includes 31 countries, 25 of them are low-income countries, and 6 of them are lower middle-income countries. Well, in general terms, these are the countries with the purest indicators in terms of all the dimensions of the development, but they have the peculiarity to be not equal countries, but they are not the most unequal. In fact, they are the 3rd most unequal countries among these 5 groups. The second cluster, cluster 2, is composed of countries with high poverty and malnutrition rates that are primary exporting and have limited political freedoms. There are 9 countries in this group. 2 of them are low-income countries, and the remaining 7 are lower middle-income countries. Well, those are the second poorest in terms of income poverty, malnutrition, non-agricultural GDP, productivity, and innovation. They have severely constrained political freedoms, high export on natural resources, and moderate inequality, still over the world average. Cluster 3 is composed of countries who are dependent on external flows and have high levels of inequality. There are 32 countries in this cluster. 2 are low-income countries, 20 are lower middle-income countries, and the remaining 10 are upper middle-income countries. These countries are ranked 3rd in terms of income poverty, malnutrition, and agricultural GDP, productivity, innovation, and air pollution. However, they have the second highest income inequality, the lowest proportion of exports in primary sector, the second highest external finance, and the second best scores in governance and democracy indicators. Cluster 4 is composed of countries who are primary exporting countries with low inequality but high environmental pollution and limited political freedoms. These are 15 countries. 5 of them are low-income countries, and 10 are upper-middle-income countries. Well, those countries are the ones with the lowest poverty and malnutrition. The second in terms of non-agricultural GDP, productivity, innovation, and external finance. But, however, they have the second highest proportion of primary export, the second worst governance indicators, the worst democracy indicators, and are the most polluting countries. And finally, Cluster 5 are unequal emerging economies with low dependence on external finance. These are 14 countries in our sample. Only one is a lower middle-income country, and the rest of them are upper middle-income countries. The main characteristic is that despite they are the most developed among the developing countries, they have the highest inequality, but also the highest non-agricultural GDP, labor productivity, innovation capacities, the best governance and democracy indicators, the lowest dependency on external finance, and the lowest poverty and malnutrition headcounts. Well, look at the map. This is let's say the main result of our research. As we can see, development clusters are scattered across the world map. But an important feature is that the two poorest groups, which are Cluster 1 and Cluster 2, are especially concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia.
Okay. So I'll talk a bit about distribution of poverty. It just occurred to me, actually, that this paper wouldn't exist without IARDI, because actually the history of this paper is a dinner and some drinks in Ankara as an IARDI meeting. And so we have this paper, and we're now planning a follow-up paper and possibly a project around it even. So let me talk about distribution of poverty. Oh yeah, you wanted to be in charge of that. So what we find is world poverty is actually distributed in, one could say, in 3 places. First of all, a third of world poverty is in India, and actually, as we come to in a moment, I think India is so unique that it actually almost needs a special set of caveats, and we'll come to that in a moment. But a third of world poverty is in the C1 countries, Cluster 1 countries that outside India, we referred to. Again, these are largely in very populous countries, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh in particular. The first 2 are middle income. Bangladesh is low income, though is projected to be middle income over the next 10 years, apparently. And then you have the remainder, just about 10% of world poverty, across the other clusters, 3 of the other clusters, and 16% of world poverty in C5, which is largely about China. I don't think. Oh, sorry. Probably that's too much detail for to look at. So we go on to move on to look at the implications. But you can look at the data in the table in the paper. So we think the classification explains poverty in a more clarifying way than the income classification. And obviously you've got a third of world poverty in India, and then another third in countries that face the greatest development challenges, we think. There seems to be a close relationship between income poverty and some of the development problems: productivity, innovation, governance, agriculture, but not overall. So the correlation between income poverty and multidimensional development, as we've chosen to explore it, is much weaker than one might expect. As was noted, poverty seems to be the greatest discriminating power of all the variables, and C1 countries share the distinct features of having high poverty counts. So what are the implications? So as with any development classification, there's countries that don't fit perfectly, and I think India's the notable example here. Biggest in terms of population and second richest actually in terms of GDP, GNI per capita in Cluster 1, the poorest group. And then we talk, in the paper we discuss the particular distinctive features of India. I think the thing that leads India to be in C1 in particular are the poorer indicators, particularly of malnutrition at over 40% and poverty at over 40%. But also per capita carbon dioxide emissions. strikingly, the cluster 1 is the most similar group to the atypical case of India. So conclusions.
Well, as we have tried to prove, building development taxonomies is not easy, but at least they give us the opportunity to reduce the complexity of the developing world and thus help us to understand some interesting features among clusters. But we have to be aware that countries do not suddenly change when they cross arbitrary borders. The fact is that some development aid agencies do treat them differently if they moved into the middle-income countries. For example, we know that DFID is not concentrated in middle-income countries. Also, the European Commission, EuropeAid, is not also focusing on middle-income countries, and probably the only exception is Spain, which is specialized in middle-income countries. But the fact is that moving into the middle-income country has some consequences for these developing countries. Our main conclusion is that more work on taxonomies is needed. Firstly, because measuring, which is a good conclusion if we want to find some financing for our project. So firstly, because measuring a multidimensional concept such as development with one single economic dimension is inherently incoherent. And this incoherency is reflected in the changing distribution of global poverty away from low-income countries. That's why, in response, we propose this multidimensional development taxonomy, and we have wondered ourselves what might Dudley Sears have said looking at our taxonomy. Well, the typical case of a developing country remains for many countries. Quoting Dudley Sears, a largely an industrialized economy with foreign trade of which consists of essentially in selling primary products. However, for many other developing countries, the reality is much different. There is an important increase in the variety of experience across developing countries, and therefore there is an increase in heterogeneity in the developing world. So how does the taxonomy of this paper compare to the income per capita classification? Well, as I already said, our taxonomy is very different. There is less than 50% of commonality between the income classification and our multidimensional classification, and we have found a large number of advantages of our classification. I will just summarize five of them. The first one is that our taxonomy is built on a clear identification of the main dimensions of development. In contrast, the income classification is based on only one economic dimension, which may be misleading. Second, cluster analysis has an important methodological advantage in the sense that it is objective and stable. Objective because the analysis of the same group of countries by the same method produces similar classification, and stable in the sense that the classification remains similar when we add new variables. In contrast, if you think on the income classification, it is more or less objective, but it's not stable at all. If you change the proxy, for example, if you use purchasing power parity instead of per capita income in Atlas method, you will find out a very different income classification, and probably a more accurate one. Thirdly, cluster analysis allows one to discern the association structure across countries. That is to say, the differences and the similarities across developing countries. And this could help us to design better tailored development policies, whereas income classification only offers information about one economic variable. Fourthly, cluster analysis deals with two intrinsic problems of the design of a development taxonomy. The first one is the number of groups in which to divide the countries. And the second one is the development thresholds across the groups. On the contrary, if you think of the income classification, both decisions are rather arbitrary. I mean, there are 3 income groups within the developing world, and the threshold is just moving every year, but we don't really know what it is exactly in $12,000 instead of 11,000 or 15,000. So it's pretty much an arbitrary definition of the threshold. And finally, I think this is the most important difference. Our taxonomy does not offer a simple linear representation of development levels, from low to high development levels. Each development cluster has its own development issues, and as we have already shown, some of them have poor indicators in some dimensions, but not in all dimensions. That is to say, there is not a group with the worst indicators and another group with the best indicators for all dimensions. Some of them have very bad indicators in some dimensions, but quite good indicators in other dimensions. If you compare this with the income classification, the income classification depicts like a linear development world, as if all developing countries were following a growth path regardless of other development dimensions. Well, the truth is that in spite of the strength of this cluster analysis, the income classification survives for its simplicity. But the truth is that different classifications have very different implications for developing policies, starting with the selection of the aid receiving countries. Quoting again Dudley Shears, the most important use of development indicators is to provide the targets for planning. And here is where it comes our normative conclusion. It was already quoted by Michel before. If it's possible to identify reasonable homogeneous development groups, it would be more appropriate to build complex development taxonomies, maybe on a 5-year basis, than just ranking countries with a very simple criteria, an economical criteria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Indeed, the world is heterogeneous, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the development strategies. I believe that there is an increasing consensus that should be appreciated more and more, and you demonstrated an interesting classification how to approach developing countries looking beyond income. So I believe that this presentation raises a number of questions, and I'll now give floor to the audience. So we start here. Thank you.
So, Andy and Sergio, first of all, thank you for a very excellent presentation, and I would like to add one thing maybe. I think it would be worthwhile to add to this cluster analysis also demographic dimension, and for example, some main demographic indicators like life expectancy, which is already included in this Human Development Index, and also, for example, infant mortality, which is an indicator which is available for most of the countries, and perhaps also to amplify the social dimension and like for indicators like illiteracy rate, which is again included in the Human Development Index, but there are other indicators like unemployment rate, even though of course it is very difficult to find reliable data about unemployment rate for developing countries. The more developed country is, the more reliable these data are, and vice versa. So this is just a suggestion, but otherwise it's a very interesting exercise, and I think this cluster analysis is very interesting to use in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, if you agree, we'll take 3 questions from the audience, then we'll have replies, and then maybe add a turn of questions. So, the next one.
You said in the end, more work on taxonomy is needed. As somebody who is an old hand in development cooperation, I would say yes. What is missing in your analysis is that in 1992, there was an agreement, basic one, on a new development narrative, which is sustainable development, with 3 dimensions: economic sustainability, environment sustainability, and social sustainability. I am missing most of these things in your analysis. So I think for having real indicators, we would have to go for sustainability indicators, where income may be one element, but maybe the less important one. Second, maybe behind this is still the thinking of, well, if you have more growth, then we are more developed. Well, we have had loads of work on this. we should take into account when we do the classification. And another assumption that there are developing countries, and on the other side there are developed countries. No, there aren't. We are all developing countries, because no country, according to sustainability indicators, has a model which could be applied in the whole world without making us explode. So maybe we have to enhance the focus, enlarge the focus, get out of the box, and look into new indicators which are scattered around, but which would be a very difficult work to put them together. Yeah? So on environmental sustainability, etc., economic and the social one. And I think some of your elements would be good points to put in, but sorry, I'm missing all the other stuff. And maybe one last point, aid is a term which means an unequal relationship between a donor and a recipient. Maybe we are talking about cooperation, so maybe we would also should question this type of, let's say, terms and go via cooperation.
Thank you. And if I may ask those posing questions to introduce yourself as well before you pose the question. The third one was over there, but you have the floor and we will have another turn of questions. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. So Aili Pyhala from University of Helsinki. Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I look forward to actually reading the paper as well. And apologies if you answered my question and went so fast and so much information that I might have missed this point. Basically, so to challenge you, I see your point that you're critiquing the income-based indicator as being too simplistic, but then I see that your proposition could also be argued for being too simplistic. And I was wondering what made you choose those five. Well, you explained your methodology in choosing your components of development, but then I wondered why you limited it to so few. So this relates to the first question. Why didn't you incorporate more dimensions? And do you envision something much more complex of really having numerous elements of development? I mean, we have technological capacity and analytical capacity to do such analysis. I very much also appreciated the previous, just before me here in front of me, the lady who commented on not having developing countries or development countries. I was also wondering why you didn't include so-called developed countries in your analysis. After all, a country may be a donor in one aspect and a recipient in another, and vice versa. And so finally, my question, I guess, is also, so if you could include, or would include, or will include other dimensions of development, which do you envision including in the future? Personally, I would have very much liked to see the subjective well-being in there, just to add some bottom-up approaches. After all, it's all us high up here in the high ivory towers taking the decisions of what is valued or what is prioritized in development, but there may be other views down in the bottom in the field of what they prioritize or prefer as development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will now give the floor to our presenters.
Do you want to go first? Yeah. Thanks. That's all very useful. I think let's just take some of these one by one. We've had a discussion over the last couple of days about adding in a future paper high-income countries. Where's Edith gone? Yeah. And I think that seems to be an interesting angle, because the kind of assumption is that the industrialized countries are somehow different. I think you're right as well. The word aid is increasingly problematic, and cooperation is probably a much better word. Funnily enough, that it's not a word that gets used in the UK very much. I don't know why. There's a kind of, people are very stuck with either aid or ODA. But I've noticed the EC and European continental Europe bilaterals are much more likely to use the word the phrase development cooperation rather than aid. I think on the other comments about sustainable development, I think we have quite a lot in there. Perhaps it didn't come through in the presentation, but on economic and social development, we have sustainability in there, and we looked at the other indicators that we might have on sustainability. One of the problems is the measurement of sustainability is enormously contentious, and the obvious data sets would be the 3 or 4 World Bank data sets on things like natural wealth, or the ecological footprint, many of which are not necessarily available over time as well. If we go on to do a second paper that's looking at over time whether these categories are stable. So while I'm sympathetic, I'd be curious to see what we could use that is available for time series data and is reasonably accepted, so that we don't have journal referees shouting at us for using it. Then, I mean, that kind of relates to the issue about subjective well-being. It would be nice to have subjective well-being in there. I think the underlying problem with what's available is the World Value Survey is only about 1,000 people per country. And typically, although it claims to be nationally representative, the World Value Survey is particularly likely to not capture many of the very poor population, judging by some of the discussions I've had with people who've used the data. So that made us cautious about using something that's only just established and based on very small samples. And that kind of relates in a way to the use of life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy, in the sense that life expectancy and infant mortality are modelled data. They're data that's been messed with already. And the literacy rate, I think, is still deeply problematic because the way it's asked in different surveys to different people, it means different things in different countries. And while we're not claiming that what we've done is perfect, we are trying to sort of manage some sense of rigor around what we are doing. Similarly, the unemployment rates we were going to include, but then we just decided that the data was just deeply problematic, because if there's no social security system, then unemployment statistics are fairly meaningless. And the choice of dimensions was based on a literature review of the last 50 years on the meaning of development, and the paper covers much of that and explains how we came to the conclusion on the choice of dimensions and on indicators.
Yeah, I would like to add a few words. Well, there is obviously a trade-off between simplicity and complexity. I mean, we could have had many more variables. I think that maybe we haven't been as modest speaking as we were in our paper, but the thing is not to say that this is the definite classification. What we wanted to prove is that the dominant classification is not working, that we could do it much better with a different methodology, and we believe that cluster analysis is a more rigorous way to build a taxonomy. And the procedure is first find which are the main dimensions of development. We found these 4. Maybe there are 5. But the controversial issue is which proxies shall we use to approximate those dimensions. And this is something that we just proposed. We just found that those were available for most of the countries. Those were interesting for using in the analysis, but I'm sure there are other interesting variables like life expectancy, literacy, etc. But the fact is that when you are building this multidimensional taxonomy, there are many variables that have very high correlation. So it doesn't matter at all if you use life expectancy or mortality as we use, because they have such a huge correlation that using only one of them is enough. So, I mean, this is a tricky issue and it's very controversial. Probably there are other better proxies, but we just use those ones for a question of simplicity and availability. Also, the issue of developed countries, including developing countries, as Andy said, is part of our future task. I really think it's going to be very interesting, and even more in the European countries. Yesterday we were talking in the ADI meeting, some people say the peripheral European countries or the southern European countries, why not the developing European countries? Maybe we should build a different taxonomy, because there are also huge differences among Europe. I mean, you cannot compare Greece with Luxembourg. There are probably more difference between Greece and Luxembourg than between Greece and the poorest country in the middle income group. So that's probably one of our priorities, to include also developing countries and try to build a real cosmopolitan taxonomy for all the countries in the world.
Can I just add one quick thing? I think you're right about, we should have made clear that it's not our intention that our taxonomy should suddenly replace or should suddenly be taken on board. The purpose of the paper was to show that the dominant way that particularly gets used is problematic and thus add to a long history of challenges to income per capita, and not to suggest that the world should suddenly do what we say, which kind of relates to Michael's point, I think. Yeah.
Thank you for those answers. I'm advised that we can still go on for a couple of minutes before we start the lunch break, and I see several people asking for the floor, so we'll continue with the next round of questions. The first goes here. Thank you.
Okay. Trošička from Educon. I have one comment and one question. So I think, as you mentioned about the taxonomy, it's really important to have it. It's really important that governments will target the resources according to the taxonomy. But what we actually see that, for example, the Czech Republic in 2010 gets 3 times more money from the EU funding than Zambia in official development aid. Yeah, so Czech Republic in 2010 get $200 USD per head, Zambia get 70 USD per head. So I think if we speak about the money flows, it should be also somehow mentioned. But my question is, when we speak especially about the countries in the first and second cluster, we see that most of the people in that countries is working less or more in semi-autark systems, family closed or village closed. So it means that the income measurements are not very relevant. I would like to know how you dealt with this question. Thank you.
Thank you for those interesting points. The second question over there, and then there is one on the back of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jürgen Wiemann from the German Development Institute and one of the vice president of EADI. I'm happy to be here again in Prague after a long time and see old friends. So this is a good opportunity to talk frankly about issues that are of concern for all of us. Since I'm especially interested in India and maybe going to India soon again, I would like to ask whether we can make a complicated story short and concrete. Andy, you mentioned that there is the debate in UK going on whether to phase out UK development assistance, not to say aid, to India. And I think the conclusion has been, or the decision has been taken already, yeah, to stop aid to India. What would your taxonomy and your conclusions you draw from your grouping of countries, and India is a special group of countries as far as I understand it, what would your conclusions be with reference to whether UK or Europe or Germany should continue or phase out aid to India? I would be extremely interested in your assessment, and whether you will have an impact if you do not agree with what the UK government is doing towards India. What would your impact be on these decisions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is indeed an interesting question. I've heard it in the context that if there is a country which is having its own airline and it's able to launch a satellite, then it's questionable whether it should be supported by foreign aid. So I wonder what will be the answers. But before that, I'll give the floor to the last question, which was back there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Petra Krylova from the Department of Development Studies at Palacký University in Olomouc. I have 2 questions on the methodology and 1 question on the results. The first question is, how did you select your sample? You mentioned it was 101 units in your sample. Based on what criteria? Was it the availability of data, or how was that selected? The second question is, based on what indicators have you assessed democracy? And the third question on the results, whether the results of your analysis are different, or how are they different with a Human Development Index classification? Obviously, they're different because Human Development Index has only 4 categories. You have 5, but whether there are any extreme differences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will continue with the questions with the last round soon after the replies. So the floor is yours.
Shall I go first? Yeah, sure. I think there's an interesting question about, as you alluded to, about aid allocations. I think there's a whole analysis that could be done about the current set of aid allocations and whether changing the taxonomy, to what extent it radically changes the allocations. Jürgen, on your point about India, the whole debate in India and UK aid has been so emotive, and in the end it was decided pretty much because the Indian government said it didn't want or need the aid. I mean, British aid is tiny. The question is whether it does any good. There's an interesting ethical question about whether the Indian government in Delhi will replace the resources that DFID was supplying to the poorest states in India. So the government in Delhi has something called the Kajgil formula that's used to decide resource allocations. Now, if you look at that, there is no reason why the government in Delhi will replace DFID's spending in those poorest states. And actually, what you have is 2/3 of poverty in India is in states of India that are technically low-income countries if you applied the threshold at a subnational level. And also half of the poverty in India is in the 5 Naxalite insurgency states. If you look at deaths in those states related to Naxalite insurgency. So the poverty problem in India is also, I mean, if you look at data on caste and you find something like 70% of poverty is related to, 70% of the poor in India are in the lower or backward castes. So you have quite a set of complex problems leading to that, plus state capabilities, of course, in particularly in the poorer states. I think for whether the UK should give aid to India is a tricky question, because on the one hand, you mentioned about satellites. I mean, Nigeria has 3 satellites. Nigeria is about to update its GDP accounting, and Nigeria is about to leapfrog India in average income. And actually, in all likelihood, Nigeria could be upper middle income in the next 5 years because of the revisions. And of course, there's no debate in the UK about aid to Nigeria. Nigeria is seen as a poor country by British citizens, so that's fine. I mean, Pakistan, you could make a similar case about the nuclear program and the spending, the opportunity cost of a nuclear program. But there's a number of developing countries who have satellites, so there's an interesting question there about alternative uses of state resources. I think underlying this is a kind of ethical question of what are the moral obligations of governments or citizens in industrialized countries to world poverty if the world's poor live in countries or subnational regions where the responsiveness of the governance structure to the poor is weak. So what if it's easier for DFID to help the poor than it is for the government of Bihar, for example? Now the question is whether you where you go with that, I think. So I mean, actually the debate in the UK is evolving now into DFID's inconsistency around how it deals with the middle-income countries that are in some ways better off than India, in some ways less so, but DFID doesn't have a consistent policy across countries. It tends to be, there's just a very right-wing press, and if they put enough pressure and make enough noise, that can be very influential, of course. And just on the data issues, Sergio might respond to some of those. We didn't look at the correlation with the Human Development Index, but that's certainly something we could do. It would be interesting. We've of course got components of that in there already, so there would be that would be interesting.
Maybe you can talk on the other points. Yeah, sure. Well, regarding the external finance comments, we included this variable that is a sum up of ODA, remittances, foreign direct investment in relation to the GDP. But that's something we should work better because the probably is a bit messy in dimension. Well, at least the proxy that we are using, and definitely it's important to measure the external finance available for each developing countries. In relation to the sample, we included 101 developing countries that have data for all proxies. So that's the limiting variable. There are 38 countries that were excluded because we didn't have enough data for them. Democracy, we use the Polity Project data set, which ranks countries from perfect autocracy to perfect democracy. And the idea of analyzing the coincidence with the Human Development Index is a very good suggestion. I guess that because HDI is highly correlated with income per capita, and because our classification has less than 50% commonality with income per capita, I guess that our classification will be also very different from the HDI classification. But that's something, I mean, it's simple to do, and it's definitely a very good idea. And thank you very much for your very useful comment. This is an ongoing research, so we are very happy to receive your feedback.